somewhere along the rocky western coast of Greece, more than 3,000 years ago, there lived a king who did not come home for 10 years after his war had ended. His name was Odysseus, and the story of his long journey back to his island, to his wife, and to his son has been told and retold for so many centuries that it has become one of the oldest continuous threads of storytelling that human beings still hold onto today. Tonight, we are going to move slowly through that story together, not to race through the plot, but to rest inside it, the way you might rest beside a fire, while someone speaks in a low, even voice about people who lived a very long time ago, before we follow Odysseus onto the sea. It helps to sit for a moment in the world he came from. The story we now call the Odyssey was composed in a form of Greek that scholars believe was shaped sometime around the 8th century before our era. Though the events it describes, if they have any basis in real history at all, would have taken place centuries earlier still, in what historians call the Late Bronze Age. This was a world of small kingdoms built around fortified hilltop palaces, of bronze swords and leather shields, of ships without compasses that hugged the coastlines, and used the stars only when they had no choice but to cross open water. The poem is attributed to a figure named Homer, though we should say gently and honestly that no one today knows with certainty whether Homer was a single person, a blind poet, as later tradition imagined him, or a name given to a long tradition of oral storytellers whose verses were passed down, generation after generation, memorized and reshaped slightly each time they were performed, long before anyone thought to write them down. This uncertainty is not something to feel unsettled about. It simply means that the Odyssey, like many of the oldest stories we know, was not born on a single day from a single hand. It grew slowly, the way a river smooths a stone, shaped by many voices over many years before it finally settled into the form we read now. The world the poem describes sits at the edge of myth and memory. There really was a city called Troy on the northwestern coast of what is now Turkey, and archaeologists have found the remains of a fortified settlement at the site called Hisarlik that was destroyed by fire sometime around the 12th century before our era, a destruction that could plausibly be connected, however loosely, to the kind of conflict the old poems describe, whether there was ever a single war fought over a woman named Helen, and whether a king named Agamemnon or a soldier named Odysseus ever truly lived, are questions that cannot be answered with certainty, and honest historians will tell you so. What we can say is that the poem preserves, in an imaginative and poetic form, real fragments of Bronze Age life. The way ships were built from planks and pegged together, the way palaces were organized around a great central hearth, the customs of hospitality that governed how strangers were welcomed into a stranger's home. That last detail, hospitality, matters more to this story than it might first seem to. In the world of the Odyssey, the relationship between a host and a guest was almost sacred, protected by the god Zeus himself in his aspect as a guardian of strangers. A traveler arriving at an unfamiliar shore had almost no other protection in the world, no laws, no soldiers to call upon, nothing but the guest host custom, which obligated the person receiving him to offer food, a bath, a bed, and safe passage onward, without demanding to know his name or his business until he was ready to share it. Odysseus, again and again throughout his journey home, will find himself testing this unwritten law, sometimes finding it honored with great warmth, and sometimes finding it broken in ways that cause him tremendous suffering. Keep this idea gently in mind as we move forward tonight. It threads quietly through nearly every place he visits. The poem itself does not begin at the beginning of the war, or even at the beginning of Odysseus's journey home. It opens 10 years after the fall of Troy, with Odysseus still missing, held on a distant island by a minor goddess, while back on his home island of Ithaca, his wife Penelope is besieged by more than 100 suitors who have taken over her household, eating her stored food, drinking her wine, and pressuring her to give up hope that her husband will ever return, and choose one of them to marry instead. Their son, Telemachus, has grown from an infant into a young man during his father's long absence, and he is now old enough to feel the shame and helplessness of watching his home be slowly consumed by men who have no right to be there. We will spend time in each of these places over the course of this documentary. On Ithaca with Penelope and Telemachus, at Troy in the story's memory, and on the many strange shores that Odysseus visits during his 10 years of wandering. Tonight, in this first quiet hour, we simply want to set the stage, the way a lamp is lit in a room before the rest of the house goes dark. Picture the wine-dark sea, as the old poem calls it again and again, a phrase whose exact meaning scholars still discuss, since the Greek word used, oinops, may describe a color, a quality of light, or perhaps even the way certain algae blooms could darken coastal water at particular times of year. Picture low wooden ships with a single square sail, rowed by 20 or 50 men at a time, moving along coastlines dotted with small kingdoms, each ruled by its own local king or chieftain, each with its own customs, some welcoming to strangers and some deeply hostile. Picture also the gods, who in this world were not distant and abstract, but felt intimately present in daily life, capable of appearing in disguise as a beggar or an old friend, capable of stirring up storms out of anger or calming the sea out of favor. The goddess Athena, patron of wisdom and strategic thinking, watches over Odysseus throughout his journey and repeatedly intervenes on his behalf, while the god Poseidon, ruler of the sea, holds a grudge against him for reasons we will come to later, and does everything in his considerable power to make sure Odysseus's voyage home is as difficult and prolonged as possible. This tension between two powerful gods, one helping and one hindering, gives the entire journey its underlying shape. A struggle not simply between one man and the sea, but between competing forces far larger than himself. It is worth pausing here to say a little about what kind of man Odysseus is understood to be, because it shapes everything that follows. He is not primarily celebrated in this poem for his strength, though he is certainly capable in battle. He is celebrated again and again for his cunning, his patience, and his adaptability. The Greek word most often used to describe him, polytropos, appears in the very first line of the poem and is difficult to translate cleanly into English. It can mean a man of many turns, a man of many ways, a man who has traveled to many places, or a man who is versatile and resourceful in the many different situations he encounters. Later in the poem, he is also called Polymedes, meaning of many devices or many wiles, a man whose gift is not brute force, but clever thinking, the ability to talk his way out of danger, to disguise himself, to wait patiently for the right moment rather than rushing forward. This quality, this patience and cleverness rather than raw force, will be tested again and again on his journey, and it is ultimately what carries him home. As we move through this documentary together, segment by segment, we will follow the geography of his 10-year voyage, roughly in the order the ancient poem presents it, moving from the shores near Troy, westward and southward, through a scattering of islands, both real and legendary, some of which correspond loosely to actual places in the Mediterranean, and some of which exist only in the realm of story. We will also occasionally pause on Ithaca itself to check in on Penelope's quiet endurance and Telemachus's slow growth into manhood, because their patience is its own kind of long journey, even though neither of them ever leaves the island. There is no need to remember every name or every place tonight. This is not a story meant to be studied under bright light with a notebook in hand. It is a story meant to be listened to slowly, the way people once listened to it around fires or in the halls of kings, letting the images settle into the mind one at a time, without hurry. If you find yourself drifting toward sleep before we reach the end of this first hour, that is exactly as it should be. The story will still be here tomorrow, unfolding at the same slow, patient pace, just as it has for well over 2,500 years. In our next segment, we will begin at the true starting point of Odysseus's long road home, standing among the smoking ruins of Troy, in the quiet, uneasy days after 10 years of war finally came to an end. The war at Troy, according to the old stories, lasted 10 long years, fought over the abduction, or perhaps the willing departure, of a woman named Helen, wife of the Spartan king Menelaus, who left with or was taken by a Trojan prince named Paris. The tale of that war is told in a different poem, the Iliad, which focuses mostly on a stretch of a few weeks near the end of the conflict. The Odyssey does does not retell that war in detail. Instead, it assumes the listener already knows the broad shape of it, and it treats the war itself mostly as memory, something the characters look back on quietly, sometimes with pride, and often with a kind of weariness. It was Odysseus, according to tradition, who finally found a way to end the long stalemate outside the city walls. The Trojan defenses had held for a decade, and neither side had been able to force a decisive victory. Odysseus is credited with devising the plan of the wooden horse, a large hollow structure built to look like an offering to the gods, inside which a small group of Greek soldiers hid themselves, while the rest of the Greek army pretended to sail away, leaving the horse behind as though abandoning their siege. The Trojans, believing the war was over and the horse was a gift, brought it inside their city walls. That night, the hidden soldiers climbed out, opened the gates for the returning Greek army, and the city fell. We will not linger on the violence of that night, because this documentary is not about dwelling on suffering, but it is worth saying plainly and gently that the fall of Troy, as the old stories describe it, was not a moment of triumph without cost. Many people died. The city burned. Families were separated, and some of the Trojan royal family, according to later tradition, were killed or taken into captivity. Even the Greek soldiers, in later retellings of this myth, are shown to feel a mixture of relief and unease about what had been done to end the war. It is against this backdrop, a victory shadowed by loss on both sides, that Odysseus and his men finally boarded their ships to sail home. Odysseus was king of a small, rocky island called Ithaca, located off the western coast of Greece in the Ionian Sea. The exact identification of ancient Ithaca with the modern Greek island that bears that name today is a subject of ongoing archaeological discussion, since the geography described in the poem does not perfectly match the modern island, and some scholars have proposed that the ancient Ithaca might correspond to a different island nearby, such as modern Lefkada. This is a small and gentle mystery, not something that needs to trouble us tonight, only something worth knowing as we picture the island Odysseus was trying so hard to reach. By the time the Greek fleet set sail from the shores near Troy, Odysseus had already been away from his home for 10 years fighting the war. He had left behind a young wife, Penelope, and an infant son, Telemachus, who would grow into manhood without ever really knowing his father. The journey home, which should have taken a matter of weeks by sea under favorable conditions, following the coastline and island hopping across the Aegean and Ionian waters, would instead take 10 more years, nearly doubling the length of his absence. The reasons for this delay unfold slowly across the poem, place by place, and we will move through them together over the coming segments at an unhurried pace. The first stop on this long and difficult journey home came almost immediately, and it set a troubling tone for much of what would follow. Odysseus and his 12 ships, carrying several hundred men in total, were blown off their intended course, and landed on the coast of a people called the Cicons, near the city of Ismarus, in the region of Thrace, in what is now northeastern Greece. This was not, in the world of the poem, a chance meeting between equals looking to trade or rest. Odysseus and his men, still carrying the momentum and habits of a decade of warfare, raided the city, took what supplies and goods they could, and killed a number of the local people in the process. It is a difficult moment in the story, and it is often treated gently or skipped over quickly in modern retellings. But it is worth sitting with for a moment, because the poem itself does not entirely excuse Odysseus for it. He is a man freshly returned from a brutal war, and the habits of raiding and taking by force do not disappear from him instantly, simply because the war has ended. The Cicons, however, did not simply accept this raid without response. According to the poem, some of the local people who had been raided fled inland and gathered reinforcements from neighboring Cicon communities, returning the following morning in far greater numbers than Odysseus's men had expected. In the fighting that followed, Odysseus's forces were pushed back to their ships, and he lost 6 men from each of his 12 vessels, a devastating toll delivered right at the outset of what was meant to be a straightforward voyage home. It was, in a sense, a warning built into the very beginning of the journey, that the world beyond Troy would not simply open itself gently to these returning soldiers, and that the habits of war would carry real consequences even after the war itself was over. After this costly encounter, Odysseus and his surviving men returned to their ships and set out again. But almost immediately they were struck by a powerful storm. The god Zeus, according to the poem, sent violent winds from the north that tore at their sails and drove the ships far off their intended course for 9 full days. This detail matters quietly for the shape of the whole story that follows, because it establishes early on that Odysseus's journey home is not simply a matter of poor navigation or bad luck in the ordinary sense. It is repeatedly described as being shaped and reshaped by the will of the gods, sometimes helping him, as Athena often does, and sometimes hindering him, as Poseidon will do for most of the journey, and here, briefly, as Zeus does as well, sending the storm that blows the fleet so far from familiar waters. By the 10th day after leaving the Cicons, still being carried by these strange winds, Odysseus's ships reached the land of a people called the Lotus Eaters. We will spend real time with the Lotus Eaters in our next segment, because their island, gentle and dreamlike as it is described in the poem, offers a natural place for us to slow down together even further. For now, in this segment, we want to simply sit with the picture of these battered ships, carrying tired and grieving men, some of them having just lost brothers and companions in the fighting at Ismarus, all of them blown far off course by winds beyond their control, drifting toward a shore none of them had ever seen before, with no clear sense of when or whether they would ever find their way home again. It is worth returning gently to Ithaca for a moment before we close this segment, because while Odysseus was making this difficult beginning to his journey, life on his home island had also begun to change in ways he could not yet know about. Penelope waited, raising their son largely on her own, managing the affairs of the household and the kingdom in her husband's long absence. Not yet besieged by suitors in these earliest years, but already beginning the long, quiet vigil that would come to define so much of her own part in this story. Telemachus was still a small child during these years, too young to remember his father clearly, growing up hearing stories about a man he could barely picture, a king whose absence shaped the household around him even before he was old enough to understand why. There's something worth noticing in the shape of this early part of the story, something that will repeat throughout the whole journey. Odysseus's difficulties are almost never simply about physical danger, though there is plenty of that. They are just as often about the tension between his own impulses, sometimes prideful, sometimes reckless, as with the raid on the Sicons, and the slow, hard-won wisdom that experience gradually teaches him. The Odysseus who finally returns home 10 years from now in the story's timeline will not be quite the same man who left the smoking ruins of Troy. The journey itself, difficult and painful as it is, will change him. For now, though, we leave him here on storm-tossed seas, his ships carrying grieving and frightened men toward an unfamiliar shore, still many, many years away from home. In our next segment, we will follow him onto the land of the Lotus Eaters, a place the old poem describes with a strange, soft gentleness, where the danger is not violence at all, but something quieter, and in its own way, more difficult to resist. After 9 days of being carried by strong winds far from their intended course, Odysseus and his men came at last to a quiet shore, home to a people the old poem calls the Lotus Eaters. Unlike the encounter with the Sicons, this was not a place of conflict or violence. In fact, it is one of the gentlest episodes in the entire journey, and yet it carries its own quiet warning, one that speaks less to danger from outside and more to a danger that can live within the human mind itself. The exact location of this land is not something scholars agree upon, and honestly, it was probably never meant to correspond to a single real place at all. Ancient and modern readers alike have sometimes associated it loosely with the coast of North Africa, in the region of what is now Libya or Tunisia, since later Greek and Roman writers occasionally used the name Laestrygonians, meaning lotus eaters, to describe communities they encountered or imagined along that coastline. But within the poem itself, the location remains dreamlike and unfixed, more a state of being than a point on a map. When Odysseus's ships landed, his men went ashore to gather fresh water and to see what kind of people lived there. The Lotus Eaters, according to the poem, were not hostile at all. They showed no interest in fighting or raiding the newcomers. Instead, in a gesture that almost mirrors the guest-host customs we spoke about earlier. Though in a strange and inverted way, they offered the sailors a taste of the food that formed the basis of their own diet. The fruit of the lotus plant. This lotus is not the same as the flower most people picture today when they hear that word. The aquatic lotus flower associated with certain Asian traditions. The lotus described in the Odyssey is generally believed by scholars to refer to a different plant entirely, possibly a type of jujube or a wild fruit native to North Africa, whose exact botanical identity remains uncertain and is still debated by classicists and botanists today. What matters for the story is not the plant's precise identity, but its effect. Any of Odysseus's men who ate the lotus fruit fell into a deep and contented forgetfulness. They lost all desire to return home. They wished only to remain on that shore, eating more of the sweet fruit, forgetting their families, their king, their island, and the entire purpose of their long journey. This is worth sitting with for a moment, in the slow and unhurried way this documentary is meant to be experienced. The danger the lotus eaters posed was not violence. No one was harmed by them in any physical sense. The danger was something softer and, in its own way, more troubling. The danger of forgetting what matters, of losing the will to continue towards something difficult but worthwhile, in exchange for an easy, dreamless comfort that asks nothing of you and gives you nothing to strive for in return. When Odysseus realized that some of his men had fallen under this spell, he acted quickly, but without cruelty. He went ashore himself, found the men who had eaten the lotus fruit, and physically brought them back to the ships, weeping and reluctant, no longer wanting to leave this gentle island where all their cares had dissolved. He had them tied beneath the rowing benches, so they could not slip away and return to the shore. And then he ordered the rest of his crew to row quickly back out to open water, away from the temptation of that soft and forgetful land, before anyone else could taste the fruit and be lost to the same contented indifference. There's a quiet lesson embedded in this short episode, one that later writers and thinkers have returned to again and again over the centuries. The philosopher and poet Alfred Tennyson, writing in the 19th century, drew directly on this scene for his poem, The Lotus Eaters, imagining the sailors longing to simply stop, to rest, to let go of duty and struggle, and simply exist in comfort, drifting through their days without ambition or care. It is not difficult to understand why this image has stayed with readers for so long. All of us, at different points in our lives, feel the pull toward that same kind of gentle forgetting, the wish to simply stop striving, to let the difficult parts of our lives dissolve into something softer and easier. And yet the Odyssey, gentle as this episode is, does not present the Lotus Eater's way of life as something to be admired or pursued. It presents it as a kind of danger precisely because it is so appealing, so easy to fall into, so difficult to resist once tasted. Odysseus's decision to physically carry his men back to the ships, even against their tearful protests, reflects something important about the character he is shown to be throughout the poem. A man who understands, even when his companions do not, that comfort and forgetting are not the same thing as peace, and that the long, difficult road home is still worth taking, even when an easier path presents itself. We might also pause here to notice something about the structure of Odysseus's journey as a whole, something that will become clearer as we continue through the following segments. Nearly every stop along his voyage tests a different quality in him. Sometimes his physical courage, sometimes his patience, sometimes his cleverness. And here, in this gentle episode, his discipline and his loyalty to a larger purpose beyond immediate comfort. The gods who watch over this journey, and the poet who first shaped it into verse so many centuries ago, seem to be building, piece by piece, a portrait of what it actually takes to find your way home when the world keeps offering you reasons to stop trying. Once the men were safely back aboard, and the ships had pulled away from the shore of the Lotus Eaters, Odysseus and his crew continued westward, uncertain of exactly where they were or how far they had strayed from the route that would have carried them home in a matter of weeks rather than years. The poem does not tell us how much time passed as they sailed on from this point, only that the sea stretched on before them, wide and mostly unknown, the coastline of the Lotus Eaters slowly disappearing behind them. It is worth imagining, for a moment, what this must have felt like for the ordinary sailors aboard those ships, men who were not kings or heroes, simply farmers and fishermen and craftsmen from Ithaca and the surrounding islands, called away from their homes for 10 years of war, and now finding themselves blown even further from everything familiar, into stranger and stranger waters, with no clear sense of how or when their journey would end. Some of them had already died at Ismarus. Some had nearly been lost forever to the gentle forgetting of the lotus fruit, and ahead of them, unknown to any of them yet, lay an island inhabited by something far less gentle than anything they had encountered so far. A race of enormous, solitary shepherds known as the Cyclops, and among them, one whose cave they would soon, unknowingly, choose to enter. We will follow Odysseus into that cave in our next segment, moving slowly and carefully through one of the most well-known episodes in the entire poem. For now, let the ships continue on, quietly, across a calm and darkening sea, carrying their tired crew forward into the unknown. From the shore of the Lotus Eaters, Odysseus and his remaining ships sailed on, until they came to a small, uninhabited island lying just off the coast of a much larger land. This larger land was home to a race of beings the ancient Greeks called the Cyclops, enormous in size, possessing a single round eye in the middle of their foreheads, and living, according to the poem, without laws, without assemblies, and without agriculture in the way settled Greek communities understood it. Each Cyclops lived alone with his flocks of sheep and goats, tending to no one but himself, answering to no council or king. A way of life the poem presents as almost the opposite of the ordered, interconnected society that Odysseus himself came from and was trying so hard to return to, leaving most of his ships anchored safely at the smaller island. Odysseus took one ship and a small group of his most trusted men to explore the larger land and see what kind of people or beings lived there. This decision, born partly out of curiosity and partly out of the hope of finding hospitality and supplies, would lead to one of the most difficult and dangerous episodes of the entire journey. They came upon a large cave near the shore, filled with pens of lambs and kids, and shelves stacked with cheeses and jars of milk. The cave's owner was away for the moment, out tending his flocks in the hills. Odysseus's men urged him to take some of the cheese and young animals and return quickly to the ship before the owner came back. Odysseus, however, wanted to wait and meet whoever lived there, hoping, as he later admits, for a guest gift, the kind of hospitality that was customary to offer a stranger in this world. It was a choice that reflects both his curiosity and, the poem gently suggests, a degree of overconfidence that would soon cause him and his men a great deal of suffering. The owner of the cave returned that evening, driving his flocks inside and sealing the entrance with an enormous boulder, one so large that the poem tells us many men working together could not have moved it. This was Polyphemus, a Cyclops, son of the sea god Poseidon, and by far the largest and strongest of his kind. When he discovered Odysseus and his men sheltering inside his cave, he demanded to know who they were and where they had come from. Odysseus, following the customs of hospitality he had grown up with, explained that they were Greek soldiers returning home from the war at Troy, and asked, according to the sacred laws of guest friendship, for food and safe passage. Polyphemus's response broke those customs entirely. He declared that the Cyclops cared nothing for the laws of hospitality or for the god Zeus, who was supposed to protect it. And without warning, he seized 2 of Odysseus's men, killed them, and ate them. The poem describes this moment plainly and without lingering on graphic detail, and we will do the same here, simply noting that it was a devastating and horrifying act that left the surviving men trapped inside the cave overnight with a creature who had shown he was willing to kill and eat them one by one, with the enormous boulder sealing the only exit. The following morning, after eating 2 more of the men for his breakfast, Polyphemus led his flocks out to pasture for the day, carefully resealing the cave entrance behind him with the same massive stone, leaving Odysseus and his remaining companions trapped inside with no way to escape and little time before the Cyclops would return and continue killing them one at a time. It was here that Odysseus's characteristic cleverness, the quality the poem returns to again and again as his defining trait, became the only tool that could save what remained of his crew. Among the supplies in the cave, Odysseus found a great trunk of olive wood that Polyphemus had been shaping into a staff. While the Cyclops was away, Odysseus and his men sharpened one end of this wood into a point and hardened it in the fire, then hid it away for the night to come. When Polyphemus returned that evening and killed and ate 2 more men, Odysseus offered him a portion of strong wine that he had brought along from the ship, a gift originally intended for a different purpose entirely. Polyphemus, unfamiliar with wine this strong and delighted by its taste, drank cup after cup, growing increasingly drunk. In a moment of what seemed like friendliness, he asked Odysseus his name, promising him, in a dark echo of the hospitality customs he had already broken, that he would grant Odysseus a guest gift in return. He would eat him last, after all his companions. Odysseus answered that his name was Nobody, a small and clever trick that would soon matter enormously. Once Polyphemus had fallen into a deep, wine-drunk sleep, Odysseus and his remaining men heated the sharpened stake in the fire until it glowed, and together they drove it into the Cyclops' single eye, blinding him. Polyphemus's roar of pain brought the other Cyclopes living in nearby caves, rushing to see what was wrong. When they called out to ask who had hurt him, Polyphemus answered that nobody was hurting him. And hearing this, believing he meant that no one at all was attacking him, the other Cyclopes shrugged and returned to their own homes, assuming he was simply unwell. The next morning, blinded and in pain, Polyphemus rolled the boulder away from the cave entrance, just enough to let his flocks out to graze, feeling along the backs of each animal as it passed to make sure none of the men were riding out on top of them. Odysseus, in one final piece of careful planning, had his remaining men tie themselves to the undersides of the largest rams, 3 animals bound together for each man, so that when Polyphemus felt only the wool along the animals' backs, he did not notice the men hidden underneath. Odysseus himself clung to the belly of the largest ram in the flock, and in this way they all made it safely out of the cave. Once they reached their ship and pushed off from the shore, Odysseus, in a moment of pride that the poem gently but clearly marks as a mistake, could not resist calling out to Polyphemus and revealing his true name, taunting the blinded Cyclops from the safety of the departing ship. This decision would have consequences that followed Odysseus for the rest of his journey. Polyphemus, now knowing the true identity of the man who had blinded him, called out to his father, the god Poseidon, asking him to curse Odysseus, to make sure that if he ever reached home at all, he would arrive late, alone, having lost all his companions, and find nothing but trouble waiting for him there. This curse, spoken in pain and fury on a rocky shore, becomes the driving force behind much of the difficulty Odysseus faces for the rest of the story. Poseidon, god of the sea, hears his son's plea, and from this point forward works consistently to delay and endanger Odysseus's voyage, sending storms, wrecking his ships, and prolonging his exile from home. It is a sobering reminder, embedded quietly within this dramatic episode, that even a clever escape from danger can carry a cost that reveals itself only much later. And that pride, even after a genuine triumph, can plant the seeds of future suffering. We leave Odysseus here, sailing away from the island of the Cyclops, his crew diminished, his pride intact, but soon to be tested further, carrying with him now the anger of one of the most powerful gods in this ancient world. In our next segment, we will follow him to the floating island of Aeolus, keeper of the winds, and then onward to a much darker and more sorrowful encounter with a race of giants who call themselves the Laestrygonians. After escaping the island of the Cyclops, Odysseus and his remaining ships sailed on until they reached a floating island, home to a figure named Aeolus, who in the world of the poem held the role of keeper of the winds, a position granted to him, the story tells us, by the god Zeus himself. Aeolus lived in a great palace on this island with his wife and his 12 children, 6 sons and 6 daughters, who had been married to one another in pairs. And the household was described as living in a state of continuous feasting and celebration, somewhat set apart from the ordinary struggles of the mortal world below. Aeolus received Odysseus and his men with warmth and genuine hospitality, the kind of welcome that stands in sharp contrast to what they had just experienced in the cave of Polyphemus. He listened to the story of the war at Troy and the long journey since, and for an entire month he hosted Odysseus and his crew as honored guests. When it finally came time for them to continue their voyage home, Aeolus gave Odysseus a remarkable parting gift: a leather bag in which he had bound up all the stormy winds of the world, leaving only one gentle western wind free, blowing steadily toward Ithaca, to carry Odysseus's ships safely and swiftly home. For 9 days, this plan worked exactly as intended. The gentle western wind carried the ships steadily toward home, and by the 10th day, Ithaca itself came into view on the horizon, close enough that the men could see smoke rising from the fires of their own homeland. Odysseus, who had personally taken charge of steering the ship this entire time, allowing himself no rest in order to make sure nothing went wrong so close to their destination, finally succumbed to exhaustion and fell asleep, believing the worst of the journey was behind him. It was in this moment of his sleep that disaster struck, born not from any monster or storm sent by an angry god, but from something much more human: simple mistrust among tired and curious men. Some of Odysseus's crew, watching him sleep, began to speculate about the mysterious leather bag he had guarded so closely since leaving Aeolus's island, assuming it must be filled with gold and treasure that Odysseus intended to keep entirely for himself rather than share among the crew. Driven by this suspicion, and by a very understandable, very human curiosity and resentment, after 10 years of hardship with little reward, they opened the bag. All the stormy winds that Aeolus had carefully bound inside came rushing out at once, and the resulting tempest drove the ships backward, away from the coastline of Ithaca that had been so close, all the way back across the sea to the floating island of Aeolus, undoing in moments what 9 careful days of steady sailing had achieved. It is one of the most quietly heartbreaking moments in the entire poem, precisely because the disaster comes not from an external monster or a vengeful god, but from ordinary human frailty, exhaustion, suspicion, and the simple, understandable desire of tired men to know what their leader has been hiding from them. When Odysseus returned to Aeolus's island and explained what had happened, hoping for a second chance, Aeolus refused to help him again. He told Odysseus plainly that a man so clearly hated by the gods, as this second disaster seemed to prove, was not someone he wished to assist any further, and he sent them away without the gift of favorable winds this time. It is worth noting how this moment reflects something the poem returns to often. Divine favor and disfavor in this world were often understood by the characters themselves as visible in a person's luck, so that repeated misfortune could easily be read by those around a suffering person as a sign of guilt or divine displeasure, whether or not that reading was entirely fair. With no more help to be found from Aeolus, Odysseus and his men rowed on, now relying entirely on their own strength rather than any favorable wind, for 6 exhausting days and nights. On the 7th day, they arrived at the land of the Laestrygonians, and here the story turns considerably darker than almost anywhere else in the entire journey. The Laestrygonians were a race of giants, and unlike the isolated, solitary Cyclops, they lived together in an organized settlement with a harbor and what appeared to be a functioning society, complete with a king. This appearance of civilization, however, concealed something far more dangerous than the crude, solitary life of Polyphemus. Odysseus, exercising the caution he had learned, perhaps, from the earlier disaster with Polyphemus, kept his own ship anchored outside the narrow harbor entrance, sending only a small scouting party ahead into the harbor, where the other 11 ships of his fleet had already sailed in and moored close together along the shore. The scouting party encountered the daughter of the Laestrygonian king first, who directed them toward her father's home. What they found there was not hospitality, but horror. The king seized one of the scouts, and without any warning or provocation, began to prepare him as food, while the enormous Laestrygonian citizens gathered along the harbor's edges and began hurling massive boulders down onto the ships trapped in the harbor below, smashing them and killing the crews trapped inside almost instantly. We will not dwell on the details of this violence, only note, gently and honestly, that it represents one of the most severe losses of the entire journey. 11 of Odysseus's 12 ships, along with nearly all the men aboard them, were destroyed in this single encounter. unable to escape the enclosed harbor before the giants could trap and attack them. Only Odysseus's own ship survived, because he had kept it anchored outside the harbor and was able to cut its mooring rope and row furiously away the moment he understood what was happening to the rest of his fleet. It was a devastating loss, arguably the single greatest disaster of the entire voyage, reducing his forces in a matter of minutes from 12 ships and several hundred men down to a single ship and its crew. From this point forward in the story, Odysseus's journey continues with only this one remaining vessel, a stark and lasting reminder of how much had already been lost since leaving the shores near Troy. It is worth pausing quietly here at the close of this segment to consider how differently this journey might have unfolded if Odysseus had approached the Laestrygonian harbor with the same caution from the very beginning that he showed, by keeping his own ship outside its entrance. This same instinct, caution learned slowly through hard experience, will continue to develop in him as the story goes on, and it stands as one of the central threads running through this entire poem. A man gradually learning, loss by loss, mistake by mistake, to temper his curiosity and his pride with patience and care. With only one ship left, and grief settling heavily over the small number of men who remained, Odysseus sailed on into unfamiliar waters once more. Ahead of him lay an island shrouded in dense forest, home to a powerful enchantress who would change the direction of his journey and the fate of his remaining crew in ways none of them could yet imagine. We will follow him there gently in our next segment. With only a single ship remaining and grief still heavy among the surviving crew, Odysseus sailed on until they reached a wooded island called Aea, home to a goddess and enchantress named Circe, daughter of the sun god Helios. This island, like many of the places in Odysseus's journey, exists more in the realm of myth and imagination than on any map that could be drawn with certainty. And ancient audiences would have understood it as belonging to a world just slightly beyond ordinary geography, where gods and mortals could meet. Landing on the island, Odysseus and his men rested for 2 full days, exhausted and mourning their losses at the harbor of the Laestrygonians. On the 3rd day, Odysseus climbed a high point on the island and saw smoke rising from a distant part of the forest, evidence of habitation somewhere inland. He decided to divide his remaining men into 2 groups, and by drawing lots, it was determined that a group led by a man named Eurylochus would go inland to investigate, while Odysseus and the rest would remain near the ship. Eurylochus and his men made their way through the forest and came upon a grand house built of polished stone, where wolves and mountain lions moved calmly among the surrounding grounds. This detail unsettled the men deeply, but strangely, the animals showed no aggression at all, approaching them with a kind of docile curiosity instead. These creatures, the poem later reveals, were once men themselves, transformed by the very enchantress who now lived inside that house. Though their gentle behavior suggests something had softened in them despite their transformation. From inside the house came the sound of a beautiful voice, singing while working at a loom, and this was Circe herself. She invited the visiting men inside with apparent warmth, offering them a meal mixed with wine, into which she had secretly stirred a magical drug. Once the men had eaten and drunk, Circe struck each of them with her wand, and they were transformed instantly into pigs, retaining their human minds and awareness even as their bodies took on the shape and appearance of swine. She then drove them out to her pigsties, where she fed them acorns and other food suited to their new animal forms, leaving them fully conscious of what had happened to them, trapped inside bodies no longer their own. Eurylochus alone had remained outside the house, suspicious of the situation, and so he escaped this fate. He ran back to the ship in a state of great distress and told Odysseus what had happened to the rest of the men. Odysseus, despite Eurylochus's pleading that they simply leave this dangerous island altogether, resolved to go alone to the house and see if he could somehow free his transformed companions. On his way through the forest, Odysseus was met by the god Hermes, messenger of the gods, who took a particular interest in helping him at this critical moment. Hermes gave Odysseus a plant called moly, described in the poem as having a black root and a white flower, difficult for mortal men to dig up, but freely given here by a god, which would protect him from the effects of Circe's magical drug. Hermes also advised Odysseus on exactly what to do once he reached the house: to eat and drink what Circe offered without fear, since the moly would protect him. And then, when Circe attempted to strike him with her wand, as she had struck the others, to draw his sword and threaten her, at which point Hermes explained she would recognize him as someone protected by greater powers, and would likely invite him into her bed instead, a customary way in this world for a god or powerful being to acknowledge that they had been outmatched or impressed by a mortal's resistance. Everything unfolded exactly as Hermes had described. Circe attempted her usual transformation on Odysseus, and when it failed to work, she was astonished, recognizing at once that this must be the very man the gods had once told her would someday resist her magic. A man named Odysseus, who was fated to visit her island on his way home from Troy. Rather than treating him as an enemy after this failed attempt, she welcomed him warmly, and the tension of the encounter shifted into something gentler and more complicated. Odysseus, following Hermes's counsel, insisted that Circe first restore his transformed companions to their human forms, and swear a solemn oath that she would attempt no further harm against him or his men before he would accept anything further from her. Circe agreed, and true to her word, she anointed the pigs with a different ointment, and they returned to their human shapes, appearing, the poem tells us, even younger and more handsome than they had been before their transformation, much to their own joyful astonishment. What followed was an extended stay on Circe's island that lasted, according to the poem, a full year, during which Odysseus and his men were treated as honored guests, feasting and resting in genuine comfort after so much hardship and loss. This year of rest stands in interesting contrast to the earlier episode with the Lotus Eaters, where a similar kind of comfortable forgetting was treated as a danger to be resisted. Here, with Circe, the poem seems to suggest something more nuanced. That rest and recovery, after such profound suffering and loss, is not inherently a danger in the same way, so long as it does not become permanent, so long as the underlying purpose of returning home is not abandoned entirely, only set aside for a season of healing. Eventually, it was Odysseus's own men, according to the poem, who gently reminded him that it was time to think again of home, that Circe's hospitality, however genuine and welcome, could not be allowed to become another kind of gentle forgetting, another version of the lotus fruit dressed in more comfortable and dignified clothing. Odysseus approached Circe and asked for her help in finally continuing his journey homeward. Circe agreed to help, but she told him that before he could safely make his way home, there was one further journey he needed to undertake first, a journey unlike any other in the story, a visit to the Underworld itself, the land of the dead, where he would need to seek out the spirit of a blind prophet named Tiresias, who alone could tell him what he needed to know to survive the remainder of his voyage and find his way home. This news, understandably, filled Odysseus and his men with dread, since no living man was expected to travel to the realm of the dead and return again. Yet Circe gave him careful instructions for how to make this journey safely, and with her guidance, Odysseus prepared to undertake the strangest and most solemn part of his entire voyage. We will follow him there gently and slowly in our next segment, into the quiet, shadowed land of the dead, where he will speak with spirits of the past, including some very dear to him, before finally being permitted to continue his long road home. Following Circe's careful instructions, Odysseus and his men set sail once more, this time toward the edge of the world as the ancient Greeks imagined it, to a place near the land of the Cimmerians, a people the poem describes as living in perpetual mist and darkness, never seeing the light of the sun. This was understood in the poem's geography to be a boundary region, a threshold between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. And it was here that Odysseus was to perform the rites Circe had taught him in order to summon the spirits of the departed. Following her instructions precisely, Odysseus dug a small pit and poured offerings into it. First a mixture of honey and milk, then sweet wine, then water, and finally he sprinkled barley over the whole offering. He then sacrificed a ram and a black ewe, allowing their blood to flow into the pit. And it was this blood, according to the poem's understanding of the dead, that would allow the spirits to briefly speak again. Since without it, the shades of the departed were understood to be faint and voiceless, mere echoes, without the strength to communicate with the living. As the blood pooled in the pit, spirits began to gather, drawn by its promise of temporary vitality, and Odysseus, sword in hand, kept them back from the offering until he could speak with the one spirit he had come specifically to find, the blind prophet Tiresias, who even in death retained the gift of prophecy that had marked him in life, a gift originally granted in a different old story by the goddess Persephone herself, allowing him alone among the dead to keep his full mind and memory rather than fading into a formless shade. Before Tiresias could be reached, however, Odysseus first encountered the spirit of a young crewman named Elpenor, who had died just before they left Circe's island. Elpenor had climbed onto the roof of Circe's house to sleep off the effects of wine, and forgetting where he was upon waking, had fallen to his death, his body left unburied in the haste of their departure. His spirit now asked Odysseus for a simple favor: to return to Circe's island once his business in the underworld was finished, and to give his body a proper burial and funeral rites, so that his spirit would not have to wander restlessly, unable to fully join the world of the dead. Odysseus promised to do so, a small and quiet moment of compassion and duty amid the vast, strange landscape of the underworld. Then came Tiresias, who drank from the blood in the pit and spoke clearly to Odysseus, offering him crucial guidance for the remainder of his journey. He warned Odysseus of the dangers still ahead: the island of the sun god Helios, where sacred cattle grazed, which Odysseus and his men must not harm under any circumstances, or disaster would follow. He also confirmed, gently but plainly, that Poseidon's anger over the blinding of his son Polyphemus would continue to trouble Odysseus's journey, though it would not prevent him from eventually reaching home, so long as he and his men exercised restraint and self-control along the way. Tiresias also spoke of what awaited Odysseus even after his eventual return: the difficult task of dealing with the suitors who had overtaken his household, and beyond that, a strange final journey he would need to undertake later in his life, carrying an oar so far inland that he would meet people who had never seen the sea and did not know what an oar was for, as a final act of reconciliation with the god Poseidon. After Tiresias finished speaking, Odysseus permitted other spirits to approach the blood and speak with him as well. And it is here that the poem turns towards something quieter and more personal than prophecy or warning. Among the spirits who came forward was that of his own mother, Anticlea, who Odysseus had not known was dead, since she had still been living when he left for the war at Troy. She told him gently that she had died of grief and longing during his long absence, worn down not by illness or age, but simply by the sorrow of missing her son for so many years without word of his fate. Odysseus, deeply moved, attempted 3 times to embrace his mother's spirit, and 3 times his arms passed through her, since the dead, however clearly they could speak, had no physical substance that the living could touch or hold. This moment is treated in the poem with real tenderness, a reminder of the emotional cost that ran alongside the physical dangers of this entire journey. The years of separation that had already caused real suffering back home long before Odysseus himself would ever learn of it. Odysseus also encountered spirits of other figures known from the broader tradition of Greek myth and the story of the Trojan War, including the great warrior Achilles, hero of the Iliad, who spoke to Odysseus with a striking and somewhat melancholy honesty about the nature of death. Achilles told him plainly that he would rather be a poor, landless servant working for another man among the living than be king over all the dead in this shadowy underworld. A sentiment that has been discussed by readers and scholars for centuries as reflecting something important about how early Greek culture understood the afterlife, not as a place of reward or punishment in any elaborate sense, but as a diminished, faded continuation of existence, far less vivid and meaningful than even the humblest life above ground. Odysseus also spoke briefly with the spirit of Agamemnon, the Greek commander who had led the war at Troy, who told him the sorrowful story of his own death upon returning home, killed by his wife and her lover in a betrayal that stood in stark and troubling contrast to the loyalty Odysseus hoped and believed Penelope was still showing him during his own long absence. This encounter serves a quiet but important purpose in the structure of the poem, planting a seed of doubt and caution in Odysseus's mind about what kind of homecoming might actually await him, even after so many years of hardship getting there. As the crowd of spirits grew larger and more insistent around the pit of blood, Odysseus, growing uneasy at the sheer number of the dead pressing close around him, decided it was time to leave this shadowed realm and return to the world of the living. He and his men made their way back to their ship, retracing their path away from the land of endless mist, carrying with them Tiresias's warnings, the sorrow of Odysseus's mother's death, and a deeper, quieter understanding of just how much was at stake in the remainder of their long voyage home. In our next segment, we will follow Odysseus back to Circe's island briefly to fulfill his promise to Elpenor, and then onward past 2 of the most famous dangers in the entire poem: the enchanting and deadly song of the Sirens, and the narrow strait guarded on either side by the monster Scylla and the great whirlpool Charybdis. After returning briefly to Circe's island to give Elpenor's body the proper burial he had asked for, building a mound over his grave and setting his oar atop it as a marker, as was customary for a sailor, Odysseus and his men prepared once more to continue their journey home. Circe met them again, and rather than simply sending them on their way, she offered Odysseus detailed guidance about the dangers that still lay directly ahead. Dangers that Tiresias had only mentioned briefly in the Underworld, but which Circe now described with far greater care and specificity. The first danger would be the Sirens, creatures whose song was so beautiful and so irresistible that any sailor who heard it would be drawn helplessly toward their island, only to crash upon the rocks and die there, joining the bones of countless other sailors who had made the same fatal mistake before them. The poem does not describe the Sirens' physical appearance in great detail, though later Greek art and tradition often depicted them as having the bodies of birds with the heads of women. A detail worth mentioning gently, since it comes largely from artistic tradition, outside the poem itself, rather than from Homer's original text. Circe gave Odysseus a specific plan for surviving this danger, one that reflects, once again, his particular gift for finding a clever solution to a problem that seemed to allow no safe passage at all. She instructed him to plug the ears of all his men with softened beeswax, so that they would be unable to hear the Sirens' song at all, and could row safely past the island without ever being tempted by it. Odysseus himself, however, wished to hear the song, driven by a curiosity that the poem presents without judgment, simply as part of who he was, a man who wanted to experience and understand the world around him, even its most dangerous corners. So Circe advised a second measure just for him. His men would bind him tightly to the mast of the ship with rope, and no matter what he said or how desperately he pleaded once the song began, they were under strict instructions, their own ears sealed with wax so they could not hear his cries, to only tie him tighter rather than release him, until they had safely passed beyond the Sirens' island altogether. Everything unfolded according to this plan. As the ship approached the island, Odysseus could see the Sirens sitting in a green meadow, surrounded, the poem notes quietly, by the bones and withering skin of sailors who had come before and never left. Their song began, and it was, in the poem's account, hauntingly beautiful, calling to Odysseus by name, praising his wisdom and his glory, promising him knowledge of all things that happen upon the wide earth, appealing not simply to pleasure, but to the deeper human desire for understanding and recognition. Bound to the mast, Odysseus strained against his ropes and begged his men to release him, but true to their instructions, they only rowed harder and bound him tighter, until the island and its song faded slowly behind them, and the danger had passed. With the Sirens safely behind them, an even more immediate danger awaited. A narrow strait, flanked on one side by a high cliff where a monster named Scylla lived, and on the other side by a much lower rock, beneath which lurked a violent whirlpool known as Charybdis. Circe had explained to Odysseus that this strait could not be avoided entirely, and that a choice had to be made between the two dangers, since attempting to pass exactly between them still brought a ship dangerously close to both. Scylla, as Circe described her, was a monster with 6 long necks, each ending in a head with rows of sharp teeth, living deep inside a cave on the cliffside, from which she would snatch sailors from the decks of passing ships as they came near, one for each of her 6 heads, each time a ship passed close enough. Charybdis, on the other side of the strait, was even more dangerous in a different way. A massive whirlpool that swallowed the sea itself 3 times a day, drawing down anything nearby, ships included, before spitting the water back out again. Circe advised Odysseus plainly that losing 6 men to Scylla, while painful, was a far better outcome than risking Charybdis's whirlpool, which could easily claim the entire ship and every man aboard it. Following this counsel, though it clearly weighed heavily on him, Odysseus chose to steer his ship close to Scylla's side of the strait rather than risk Charybdis, and he deliberately did not tell his men the full details of what Circe had warned him about Scylla specifically, reasoning, the poem tells us, that there was nothing they could do to defend against her anyway, and that knowing in advance would only add fear and dread to their final approach without changing the outcome. As they passed through the strait, Scylla did indeed reach down from her cave and seize 6 of Odysseus's men, one for each of her heads, lifting them screaming from the deck as the rest of the crew watched in horror, unable to do anything to stop it or to help them. The poem describes this moment with real sorrow, noting that this was, in Odysseus's own later telling of the story, one of the most painful sights he witnessed in his entire journey, watching men he had led and fought alongside for so many years die in a way he could not prevent, having made the deliberate choice that led them into that danger, even knowing it was, by Circe's own counsel, the lesser of 2 terrible outcomes. We will not dwell further on the details of this loss, only note that it represents another step in the slow, painful reduction of Odysseus's crew across the course of this long journey, from the several hundred men who had originally sailed with him from Troy, down now to a much smaller number still remaining on his single surviving ship. Each loss along the way, from the Cicons to the Laestrygonians to this narrow strait, has carried its own particular sorrow, and the poem does not ask us to forget any of them as the story moves forward, even as it must, of necessity, continue on toward whatever awaits at its end. Having survived the strait, though diminished once again, Odysseus and his remaining crew sailed onward, and soon came within sight of the island of Thrinacia, home to the sacred cattle of the sun god Helios, the very island that both Tiresias and Circe had warned him about so seriously, insisting that these cattle must not be harmed under any circumstances. Odysseus, remembering these warnings clearly, wished to sail past the island entirely without stopping. But his men, exhausted and worn down by grief and constant danger, pleaded with him to let them land there instead, if only to rest for a single night before continuing on. We will follow what happened next, gently and slowly, in our following segment, as this island becomes the site of the final, most costly mistake of the entire voyage, one that will leave Odysseus, at last, entirely alone, against his own better judgment, but moved by the exhaustion and pleading of his remaining men. Odysseus agreed to land on the island of Thrinacia, home to the sacred cattle and sheep of the sun god Helios. Before allowing anyone ashore, he made his men swear a solemn oath that they would not harm any of the animals grazing there, and would content themselves only with whatever food supplies remained aboard the ship from Circe's island. For a time, this oath was kept, and the crew rested peacefully on the island's shore, grateful simply for solid ground beneath them after so much hardship at sea. Trouble arrived not through any deliberate defiance at first, but through simple bad luck, compounding an already difficult situation. Strong wind rose up and did not settle for a full month, trapping Odysseus and his men on the island far longer than any of them had intended. And as the days passed, their food supplies from the ship steadily dwindled until there was nothing left at all. The men, growing desperate with hunger, turned to fishing and hunting birds along the shore. But these efforts were not enough to sustain them, and the constant, unrelenting hunger began to wear away at the resolve they had shown in keeping their earlier oath. Odysseus, during this time, withdrew a short distance from the others to pray to the gods for guidance and relief. And while he was away, exhausted, he fell asleep, a moment of vulnerability that would prove costly. It was during this absence that Eurylochus, the same man who had once escaped Circe's transformation by remaining cautious outside her house, now argued to the rest of the crew that a slow death by starvation was a worse fate than risking the anger of the gods, and he persuaded them to kill some of the sacred cattle, reasoning that if they ever made it home safely, they could build a temple to Helios in recompense. And if the gods chose instead to sink their ship in punishment, then at least death by drowning would come quickly, rather than the long, grinding suffering of starvation they were currently enduring. The men sacrificed several of the cattle in as respectful a manner as they could manage under the circumstances, and feasted for 6 days on the meat, even as they understood, with real unease, that they were violating the clear warning both Tiresias and Circe had given them. When Odysseus awoke and returned to the shore, he was horrified to discover what had happened. But the deed, of course, could not be undone. Helios, the sun god, learned of this violation and was furious, since these cattle were sacred to him in a very particular and personal way. He went to Zeus and the other gods and demanded justice, threatening that if he were not given proper satisfaction for this offense, he would take his son down into the underworld and shine there instead, withholding daylight from the world of gods and mortals alike, until the wrong was made right. Zeus agreed to punish those responsible. When the winds finally calmed and Odysseus's men set sail once more from Thrinacia, believing perhaps that they had escaped any real consequence for what had happened. Zeus sent a sudden and violent storm, striking the ship with a thunderbolt that shattered it completely. Every man aboard except Odysseus himself was killed in this single, sudden disaster, a devastating and final end for a crew that had already endured so much loss across the years of this journey. It is a quiet, sorrowful moment in the poem, marking the complete end of the company that had once sailed with Odysseus from Troy in 12 full ships. Now, after all these years and all this suffering, he alone remained. Odysseus survived by lashing together the broken mast and keel of the wrecked ship into a makeshift raft, and he drifted on this wreckage for many days, eventually being carried back, in a grim twist of fate, past the very strait where Scylla and Charybdis waited. This time, he was pulled toward the whirlpool of Charybdis itself, and he survived only by clinging desperately to a fig tree growing from the rocks above the whirlpool, holding on until the wreckage he had been using was eventually spat back out by the churning water, at which point he dropped down, retrieved it, and paddled away to safety with his hands, alone now in the middle of a vast and empty sea. For 9 more days, he drifted on this simple raft of broken wood, until finally, on the 10th day, he washed ashore on the island of Odyssey, home to a goddess named Calypso, whose name in Greek carries a meaning close to the one who conceals, or the concealer, a fitting name for what was about to happen to Odysseus next. Calypso took him in, cared for him, and over time, the poem tells us, came to love him deeply, wishing to keep him with her permanently on her remote and beautiful island, offering him even the extraordinary gift of immortality if he would agree to stay with her forever as her husband, forsaking any further attempt to return home to Ithaca. Odysseus remained on Calypso's island for 7 long years, far longer than he had spent in any other place throughout his entire journey, including the year with Circe. The poem describes these years with a particular, quiet sadness. Calypso treated him with genuine kindness and real affection, and the island itself is described as extraordinarily beautiful, filled with fragrant cedar and sweet-smelling herbs, soft meadows, and clear springs. And yet, despite all of this comfort and the astonishing offer of immortality itself, the poem tells us that Odysseus spent much of this time sitting alone on the rocky shore, weeping quietly as he looked out over the sea toward the home he could not reach, unable to find any way off the island on his own. This image of a man offered every comfort imaginable, including a life that would never end, and still choosing in his heart to long for the far more limited, far more uncertain life of returning to his aging wife and the modest, rocky island he ruled as king, has been discussed by readers for centuries as one of the most quietly profound moments in the entire poem. It suggests something the story seems to want us to sit with gently, that a life of comfort and ease, however genuine, is not the same thing as a meaningful life, and that the particular, imperfect, mortal relationships and responsibilities Odysseus had built over his lifetime mattered to him more than an eternity of painless immortality with someone who, however kind, was not truly his own. It was Athena, Odysseus's steady protector throughout this long journey, who finally intervened on his behalf. She appealed to Zeus, pointing out how long Odysseus had suffered, and how unjust it seemed that a man of his loyalty and endurance should remain trapped indefinitely on a remote island, far from the home and family he had spent so many years trying to reach. Zeus agreed and sent the god Hermes to Calypso's island with a direct command. She was to release Odysseus and help him build a raft so he could finally continue his journey home. Calypso, though clearly saddened by this instruction, obeyed the will of Zeus. She helped Odysseus construct a sturdy raft, provided him with food and wine and favorable winds, and after 7 long years on her island, Odysseus finally set out once more across the open sea, alone, toward home. In our next segment, we will follow this final, difficult stretch of his journey through one more shipwreck sent by the still angry Poseidon to the shores of a kind and welcoming people called the Phaeacians, who will finally, after all these years, provide him with safe passage back to Ithaca itself. After leaving Calypso's island on his simple raft, Odysseus sailed for 17 days under favorable conditions, guided by the stars just as Calypso had instructed him, keeping the constellation of the Great Bear on his left hand as he traveled eastward toward home. On the 18th day, land finally came into view, the shadowy mountains of a place called Syria, home to a seafaring people known as the Phaeacians. It seemed, for a moment, as though the worst of his journey might finally be behind him. But Poseidon, still holding his old grudge over the blinding of his son Polyphemus so many years before, caught sight of Odysseus so close to reaching safety, and raised one final storm against him, whipping up violent winds and enormous waves that battered the raft apart entirely, leaving Odysseus struggling alone in the open water, without even the simple wooden vessel that had carried him this far. In this moment of extreme danger, a sea goddess named Ino took pity on him, appearing in the form of a seabird and offering him a magical veil that would keep him safe from drowning if he wrapped it around his chest and swam for shore, leaving behind the last remnants of his raft. For 2 full days and nights, Odysseus swam and struggled through the rough water, and even the goddess Athena intervened quietly on his behalf once more, calming certain winds and helping guide him toward land. When he finally reached the shore of Syria, exhausted beyond words, he was in such poor condition, his skin swollen with salt water and his body utterly depleted, that he crawled beneath a pair of olive bushes growing close together near the riverbank, covered himself with a pile of fallen leaves for warmth, and fell into an exhausted sleep, with no idea yet what kind of people lived on the land he had washed up on. The following morning, a young princess named Nausicaa, daughter of the Phaeacian king Alcinous, came to that same riverbank with her attendants to wash clothing, a task the poem describes with unhurried, everyday detail. The laundry laid out to dry in the sun, the young women playing a game with a ball while they waited for the clothes to dry. It was the sound of their laughter and their ball game that woke Odysseus from his sleep beneath the olive bushes. Emerging, naked, and covered only in a leafy branch he quickly fashioned for modesty, salt-crusted and wild in appearance after his ordeal at sea. He approached the group cautiously, and unsurprisingly, most of Nausicaa's attendants fled in fear at the sight of him. Nausicaa alone stood her ground, and this moment is treated in the poem with real gentleness and respect for her composure and character. Odysseus, drawing on all his old skill with careful and persuasive speech, addressed her humbly, comparing her beauty to that of a young palm tree he had once seen, and asking simply for clothing and direction toward the city, without approaching her directly or causing her any alarm. Nausicaa, recognizing that this must be a stranger deserving of the hospitality customs so central to this entire world, and clearly impressed by his careful, respectful manner, despite his rough appearance, agreed to help him, providing clothing and guiding him toward her father's palace, though she asked him to follow at a discreet distance so as not to invite gossip among her people about how they had met. At the palace of King Alcinous and Queen Arete, Odysseus was received with the warm hospitality that had been so often and so painfully absent throughout the rest of his journey. The Phaeacians, a people the poem describes as particularly favored by the gods, and skilled above all others in seafaring, fed him, bathed him, and though they did not yet know his name or his story, treated him as an honored guest deserving of comfort and respect, exactly as the old customs demanded. Over the course of a great feast held in his honor, a blind court poet named Demodocus sang songs about the war at Troy, and Odysseus, hearing his own past recounted in verse by a stranger who had no idea he was singing to one of the very men who had lived through those events, wept quietly, covering his face so the others would not notice his tears. King Alcinous did notice, however, and gently asked his guest at last to share his true name and his story, promising that the Phaeacians, renowned for their ships, would carry him safely home to wherever he needed to go, once they understood who he was and what he had endured. It was here, in the halls of King Alcinous, that Odysseus finally revealed his identity and told the long story of everything that had happened to him since leaving Troy: the raid on the Cicons, the Lotus Eaters, the cave of Polyphemus, the winds of Aeolus, the disaster at the harbor of the Laestrygonians, his year with Circe, his journey to the Underworld, the Sirens and the Strait of Scylla and Charybdis, the fatal mistake on the island of the sun god's cattle, and finally, his 7 years on Calypso's island before washing up, alone and exhausted, on their own shore. This telling forms a very large portion of the poem itself, structured as Odysseus's own long recollection, delivered gently and patiently to his hosts over the course of an evening. Moved by this story, King Alcinous and his people kept their promise. They loaded a ship with treasures and gifts for Odysseus, far more than he had ever possessed even before the war. And the finest rowers among the Phaeacians carried him, at last, across the final stretch of sea toward Ithaca. Odysseus, utterly exhausted after everything he had endured, fell into a deep and peaceful sleep during this final voyage, and the Phaeacian sailors, arriving at Ithaca while he still slept, gently carried him ashore along with all his gifts, laid him carefully on the sand, and departed quietly without waking him before sailing home again. When Odysseus finally woke, he did not immediately recognize his own homeland, since Athena had wrapped the island in a protective mist to disguise it, wanting to speak with him first before he revealed himself to anyone, so that they could plan carefully for what still needed to be done. For although Odysseus had finally, after 20 years away, 10 at war and 10 more on this long and difficult voyage home, returned to the shores of Ithaca, his troubles were not entirely finished. His own household remained occupied by the many suitors who had spent years pressuring Penelope to remarry, consuming the wealth of his kingdom in the process. And a final, careful task still remained before Odysseus could truly reclaim his home and his family. Athena appeared to him, first in disguise and then in her true form, and together they began to plan quietly and patiently, in keeping with the careful, unhurried wisdom that had carried Odysseus through so much of his journey already, for how he might reveal himself gradually, testing the loyalty of those in his household, reconnecting first with his son Telemachus, who was now grown into a young man, before finally confronting the suitors who had overtaken his home. This final part of the story, the quiet, careful reunion with his family and the restoration of order to his household, unfolds gently over the remaining portion of the poem, a fitting close to a journey that was defined, from its very first page, not by speed or force, but by patience, endurance, and the slow, hard-won wisdom of a man finding his way, at long last, back to where he belonged. Here, we bring our own long journey through this ancient story to a gentle close as well. Odysseus, after 20 years away from home, has finally set foot once more on the shores of Ithaca, his island kingdom waiting quietly for him under a soft morning mist, his wife and son still unaware that the long wait is finally, truly, coming to its end. It is a fitting place to leave him, resting on familiar sand at last, as we, too, let this story settle quietly into rest alongside him.